The year 180 AD opens like a twilight. It is not only the last year of Marcus Aurelius' life, but the terminal point of a long war effort that consumed the men, resources, and certainties of the Roman Empire. The Marcomannic Wars, which began almost 15 years earlier, are no longer a sudden crisis but a structural condition, a border war that transformed the Danube into a permanent line of friction between the Roman and barbarian worlds. In this scenario, the 180 is not born from nothing. It is the direct son of the 179. It inherits its unresolved tensions, partial victories, incomplete pacifications. Understanding the last year therefore means going back a few months and observing what Rome brings with it: a tired but still fearsome army, a philosopher-emperor who continues to command from the front, and Germanic and Sarmatian populations who are no longer simple external enemies, but forced interlocutors of a fragile balance. The story of 180 AD therefore begins from its immediate legacy, from what the previous year left pending, like a battlefield the next morning, when the smoke has cleared but the wounds are still open. At the end of 179 AD, the situation on the Danube front appears, at least on the surface, to be under control. The great invasions that had swept the frontier in the 1960s and 1970s were repelled. The legions regained the initiative, and many tribes were defeated or forced to surrender. Yet, precisely this apparent stabilization hides the profound nature of the conflict. Not a resolved war, but an administered war. The Marcomanni and Quadi, defeated by repeated campaigns and systematic devastation, were not annihilated, because Rome did not fight wars of extermination, but of control. Their kings swore loyalty, handed over hostages, accepted very harsh conditions, including the ban on approaching the Danube and the obligation to provide military contingents to the Roman army. However, these impositions are maintained only as long as military pressure remains constant. Rome knows this well, and for this reason 179 does not end with a general withdrawal, but with the permanence of the legions in advanced territory, in a position that is both victorious and precarious. The LXXII-Sarmatians, severely defeated in previous years, represent another example of incomplete pacification. The sources tell us about deportations, about the transfer of knights to the Roman army, about agreements that drastically reduced their autonomy. But here too Roman control was more formal than real. The Great Plains between the Tisza and the Danube remained difficult to control, and any reduction in the military presence risks reigniting the conflict. Thus, at the end of 179, the empire found itself engaged in a sort of permanent armed occupation, which consumed resources and required continuous vigilance. It's not a peace, it's a monitored truce. From the Roman point of view, 179 was a year of consolidation rather than major battles. After the previous offensive campaigns, Marcus Aurelius favored targeted, punitive operations aimed at breaking the resistance capacity of the rebel tribes and preventing new coalitions. This meant exhausting marches, burning of villages, taking of prisoners, destruction of crops. A tough war, often invisible in great narratives, but decisive in the daily reality of the front. The legions, dispersed in a constellation of forts and advanced camps, carried out a job of capillary control of the territory, which requires discipline and resistance rather than spectacular heroism. The price of this long war is clearly felt. The Roman army of 179 is no longer that of the Antonine Golden Age. The losses accumulated over the years have forced extraordinary recruitment, the enlistment of freed slaves, gladiators, and increasingly less Romanized provincials. The average quality of the troops remains high thanks to the training and disciplinary structure, but the continuous turnover leaves its mark. Many departments have been away from their provinces of origin for years, and the Danube has become a second forced homeland. This wear and tear isn't just physical, it's also psychological. The sources do not speak openly of a moral crisis, but suggest a widespread tiredness, mitigated only by the constant presence of the emperor, who continues to share the life of the camp, strengthening the loyalty of the troops with his personal example. Marcus Aurelius, at the end of 179, was a marked man. His health is fragile, probably compromised by years of campaigning, by the harsh climate, by the diseases that periodically strike the camps. Yet he remains in command. It is not just a political choice, but also an ideological one. For Marcus Aurelius, the war against the peoples of the north is a moral duty, a necessity imposed by the role that destiny has assigned to him. In his thoughts, which we know through the Meditations, war is not glorified, but accepted as part of the world order. This attitude is reflected in the conduct of the conflict: firm, rational, without unnecessary impulses, but also implacable. On a strategic level, the great project that hovers over 179 is that of the possible transformation of the territories beyond the Danube into new Roman provinces. The idea of a provincial Marcomannia and Sarmatia is not a modern fantasy, but a concrete hypothesis, supported by the stable presence of the legions in traditionally barbaric areas. However, at the end of 179, this project is still unfinished. The political and military conditions are not fully mature, and the commitment required would be enormous. Rome is powerful, but not infinite, and each new province means permanent garrisons, civil administration, infrastructure. The empire can only afford this if peace is guaranteed, and that peace, on the Danube, remains fragile. Thus 179 ends without a definitive conclusion. The weapons are not completely silent, but neither do they resonate as in the most dramatic years of the invasion. It's a suspended year of armed waiting. The tribes observe the Roman movements, ready to detect any sign of weakness. The Roman commanders strengthen their positions, aware that any mistake can rekindle the fire. And above all this, like a lengthening shadow, there is the awareness that the emperor is mortal. Nobody says it openly, but everyone knows that the continuity of the war also depends on his person. The legacy of 179, therefore, is not only military, it is political and symbolic. An apparently stable front, but closely linked to the presence of Marcus Aurelius. It is with this weight that the empire enters 180 AD, bringing with it a war that is not yet over and a future that is starting to become uncertain. When 180 AD begins, winter is still heavy on the Danube front. The river, which for months of the year is a natural barrier and symbolic line of the empire, in this season becomes an ambiguous element. Frozen in some sections, it slows down movements but does not prevent them, and forces both sides to maintain constant vigilance. Marcus Aurelius is still present on the front, probably between Vindobona and Sirmium, in that band of territory which in recent years has become the true political center of the empire. Rome, the eternal city, is far away. The decision-making heart now beats along the Danube, among tents, forts and camps that smell of damp wood, iron and smoke. The year opens without solemn proclamations or major offensives announced, but under the sign of continuity. The war is not over, and the immediate task is not to conquer, but to maintain. The position of the emperor at the beginning of 180 AD is that of a commander who knows he finds himself in balance between military necessity and human limitation. The sources do not give us a detailed diary of his movements, but archaeology and literary evidence agree in placing him still on the Pannonian front, close to the legions that guarded the most delicate sectors. It is not a purely symbolic presence. Marcus Aurelius continues to preside over war councils, to receive reports from provincial governors and legionary legates, to intervene in strategic decisions. His authority, consolidated by years of campaigns shared with soldiers, remains an essential element for the cohesion of the army. In such a long conflict, the figure of the emperor is not only supreme command, but a moral point of reference. The Roman army deployed at the beginning of 180 was impressive, but distributed over a vast front. The legions of Upper and Lower Pannonia, Moesia and Noricum constitute the backbone of the defense, supported by numerous auxiliary units recruited throughout the empire. It is not a compact mass ready to move in a single direction, but rather a network of garrisons, forts and advanced camps, connected by military roads and well-established logistics. Each sector has its commander, each fort its garrison, and coordination is guaranteed by a chain of command that functions with precision, despite the distance and communication difficulties. It is a managed war, made up of written orders, relays, daily reports, rather than sudden charges. The disposition of the troops reflects the experience accumulated in previous years. The Romans learned that the danger does not only come from large barbarian coalitions, but also from rapid incursions, local rebellions, sudden changes of alliance. For this reason they maintain a constant presence even beyond the Danube, in formerly barbaric territory, with advanced outposts that act as observation points and bases for rapid interventions. These garrisons are not cities, but essential military structures, often temporary, built of wood and earth, designed to resist long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Their function is above all preventive, to report suspicious movements, dissuade rebellions, remind the subjugated tribes that Rome is still there. On the opposite front, the Germanic and Sarmatian populations were going through a phase of profound transformation. The defeats suffered in previous years have reduced their ability to conduct major offensives, but have not eliminated the structural causes of the conflict. Demographic pressure, competition for resources, internal tensions between clans and leaders continue to push armed groups towards the border. Furthermore, Roman interference in tribal balances, through the imposition of loyal kings or the obligation to provide military contingents, generates resentment and instability. At the beginning of 180, many formerly subjugated communities were actually suspended between obedience and waiting, ready to rebel if the Roman presence were to weaken. The barbarian movements in this period are difficult to reconstruct in detail, but the sources indicate a fluid situation. There are no major invasions, but continuous movements of smaller groups, armed gangs trying to evade controls, plunder less protected territories or relocate to more favorable areas. For Roman commanders, distinguishing between migration and open hostility is often impossible. Every movement can be a threat, and every hesitation can cost you dearly. This uncertainty forces the army into a permanent state of alert, which weighs on discipline and resources, but which is considered indispensable. The Roman logistical machine, at the beginning of 180, is one of the most impressive elements of the entire conflict. Supplying tens of thousands of men in a frontier region, often ravaged by years of war, requires enormous effort. Grain, salted meat, fodder for horses, weapons, equipment. Everything must arrive regularly, along roads that cross unstable territories. The internal provinces of the empire are called upon to support this effort, and the fiscal burden is significant. However, the continuity of supplies is also a political message. It shows that Rome, despite the difficulties, is still able to mobilize its resources on a large scale. Inside military camps, life flows according to rigid rhythms, marked by discipline. Winter reduces large-scale operations, but does not eliminate work. Defenses are strengthened, structures are repaired, recently arrived recruits are trained. Many soldiers are veterans of previous campaigns, men who have seen the front collapse and rebuild several times. Alongside them there are young people recently recruited, coming from distant provinces, for whom the Danube represents the first real testing ground. The Roman army, at this moment, is a complex human mosaic, in which different languages, origins and traditions coexist under the authority of command and under the sign of the eagle. Marcus Aurelius observes all this with the gaze of someone who knows the weight of time. His decisions at the beginning of 180 were not oriented towards a major decisive offensive, but towards stabilization. Every move must take into account the resistance of the army, the climatic conditions, the loyalty of the subjugated tribes. It is likely that the emperor is already reflecting on the future of the war, on how to end it without compromising border security. But the future is uncertain, and the present requires caution. As long as the legions remain deployed and operational, peace is possible. If they were withdrawn too soon, the risk of a new collapse would be immediate. Thus, the beginning of 180 AD is not marked by a single sensational event, but by a widespread, almost silent tension. It is the quiet noise of an army preparing, of an enemy observing, of an emperor who continues to bear the weight of a war now entered its final phase. The Danube flows slowly and coldly, an indifferent witness to a fragile balance. Everything is ready to move forward or to stop, but no one, at that moment, can know which of the two paths will be taken. As 180 AD progresses, the center of gravity of the war is not only geographical but human, concentrated in the figures who exercise command on the Danube front. After years of campaigns, the Marcomannic War is no longer the result of sudden decisions, but the outcome of a complex command machine, refined by experience and supported by men who have learned to govern uncertainty. Marcus Aurelius remains the undisputed summit of this structure, but his role, in the last year, is increasingly that of guarantor of general order rather than director of each individual operation. The daily burden of military management weighs on generals and legates, men who act within a margin of supervised autonomy, called to make quick decisions in a context where communications are slow and situations can change in the space of a few hours. The Roman command on the Danube in 180 was the product of a natural selection imposed by the war itself. Many inept or unfortunate officers had been eliminated in previous years, replaced by men hardened by tough campaigns, often fought far from the spotlight of official history. These commanders know the territory, the habits of the enemies, the limits of their troops. They are not mythical figures, but professionals of frontier warfare, accustomed to operating in difficult conditions and maintaining discipline in situations of prolonged attrition. Their authority comes not just from rank, but from credibility built in the field. In this context, Marco Valerio Maximiano emerges with particular importance. one of the most active and reliable generals of the last phase of the Marcomannic Wars. His career, attested by inscriptions and literary sources, reflects the typical profile of the frontier commander of the Antonine Age: consolidated military experience, administrative ability, loyalty to the emperor. Maximian is not a charismatic leader in the epic sense of the term, but a man of method, capable of conducting complex operations in an orderly manner and maintaining control over heterogeneous departments. In 180 AD, its role was crucial in guaranteeing the holding of the advanced positions and in coordinating actions against possible outbreaks of rebellion. The operations entrusted to Maximian are not those that produce large pitched battles, but those that decide the stability of the front. Surveillance of subjugated territories, rapid interventions against hostile groups, protection of supply lines. Thankless tasks, often invisible, but fundamental. It is in this type of war that the quality of a commander is measured. An error in judgment can cause a local uprising, a delay may allow an enemy group to cross the border, excessive punishment can fuel new hatred. Maximian, according to what we can reconstruct, manages to maintain a difficult balance, applying force decisively but without transforming it into indiscriminate destruction. Other generals and legates operate alongside him, less well known but equally essential. Provincial governors with military skills, legion commanders who spent much of their careers on the Danube, officers of the auxiliary troops recruited from provincials who know border warfare well. This plurality of figures creates a complex command network, in which local initiative is indispensable but must always be part of an overall strategy. Marcus Aurelius, although debilitated, continues to exercise careful supervision, receiving reports and intervening when necessary to resolve conflicts of competence or correct decisions deemed risky. The relationship between the emperor and his generals in 180 is marked by a trust built over time. Marcus Aurelius is not a distant ruler. He shared years of marches, camps, and dangers with these men. This common experience reduces tensions and strengthens cooperation. At the same time, no one is unaware that the emperor is ill and that the future of the supreme command is uncertain. This element introduces additional caution into decisions. No general wants to appear too bold or too autonomous, but no one can afford to be inactive. The war continues, regardless of the state of health of those who direct it. From the barbarian point of view, the presence of stable and recognizable Roman commanders has an ambiguous effect. On the one hand, it reinforces the impression of solid and lasting Roman control. On the other, it personalizes the conflict. Some tribal leaders know the names of Roman generals, fear their reputations, or seek to exploit their habits. In a long-lasting conflict, war also becomes a game of mutual knowledge. The Romans study their enemies, but the enemies also study the Romans. The figure of Maximian, like that of other experienced commanders, thus becomes an integral part of the balance of power on the border. Troop management is one of the most delicate aspects of command in the 180. After years of war, maintaining discipline without breaking morale is a constant challenge. Generals must balance rigor and understanding, punishments and rewards. Military decorations, promotions, grants of leave become essential tools to motivate men who have been fighting away from home for too long. Here, too, the experience of the commanders makes the difference. An inexperienced general can only rely on repression. An experienced person knows that loyalty is also built by recognizing sacrifices. During 180, the Roman command also faced problems of interprovincial coordination. Operations on the Danube involve multiple provinces and multiple chains of command, and the need for coherent action is clear. Marcus Aurelius acts as a unifying element, but the generals in the field must cooperate with each other, share information, avoid overlaps or gaps in control. This work, invisible in the great narratives, is actually the foundation of the stability of the front. The Marcomannic War, in its final phase, is won or lost more in organizational details than in sensational clashes. The image that emerges from 180 AD is that of an army led by competent men, aware of being in a decisive moment. There is no room for improvisation, but not even for inertia. Marcus Valerius Maximian and the other generals embody a pragmatic Romanism, far from rhetorical heroism but capable of supporting a prolonged war effort. Their work does not aim at personal glory, but at the maintenance of the empire. In this sense, the Roman command in 180 represents one of the last examples of that military ruling class that guaranteed centuries of domination to Rome. Men trained in discipline, hardened by war, aware that victory, at times, simply consists in ensuring that the border holds for another year. In 180 AD, the war along the Danube was fought not only with weapons, but with space. Every military decision is inseparable from geography, and every success or failure depends on the ability to occupy, control, and make inhabitable a territory that, by its nature, resists the Roman order. The Danube border is not a clear line drawn on a map, but a deep, irregular band made up of secondary rivers, forests, swamps, and hills, where dominion is measured in days of march and not in kilometers. Over the previous years, Rome has learned that simply defending the southern bank of the river is not enough. For this reason, even in 180, the Roman military presence extended beyond the Danube, in a network of outposts that represented both a threat and a promise. Threat for those thinking of rebelling, promise of protection for those who accepted the imperial order. These outposts are not cities in the Roman sense of the term, but functional military structures, often created as temporary camps and then stabilized over time. Wood and earth forts, reinforced by palisades and ditches, built quickly but with standardized criteria that reflect centuries of engineering experience. Their arrangement is not random. Each garrison controls a strategic node, a ford, a crossroads of tracks, a valley that allows access to the river. Together, they form a surveillance network that reduces the space for maneuver of the barbarian groups and allows the Roman army to intervene quickly. In 180 AD, this network is now mature, the result of continuous adjustments based on errors paid dearly in previous years. Some of these outposts are located in locations that, just a few years earlier, would have seemed too exposed. The choice to keep them active indicates confidence, perhaps prudent but real, in the army's ability to support an advanced presence. However, no one is unaware that these facilities are vulnerable. Isolated, often surrounded by hostile or ambiguous populations, they are completely dependent on supply lines and the speed of relief. For this reason, the garrisons are made up of selected departments, used to operating autonomously and resisting any sudden sieges. Life in these outposts is hard, marked by waiting and the awareness of being the first target in the event of a resumption of hostilities. On the southern bank of the Danube, the defense system appears more solid and stratified. Here stand the large legionary forts, true permanent centers of Roman power, around which civilian settlements, merchants, and families of soldiers gravitate. These places are not just military bases, but administrative and logistical hubs. The entire front depends on their functioning. In 180, they also represent a symbol, the materialization of the Roman will to stay. Every reinforced wall, every tower repaired after the winter is a clear message to enemies and allies. Rome is not preparing a hasty retreat. Control of the territory also passes through roads. The military roads connecting the forts and outposts are constantly maintained, despite the difficult climate and hostile terrain. Without them, the army would be blind and slow. In 180 AD, a large part of the operations consists precisely in ensuring that these arteries remain passable, that the bridges are safe, that the fords are protected. It is patient work, often invisible, but decisive. Roman superiority does not lie only in the number of legions, but in the ability to move them in a coordinated and predictable way for the commanders, unpredictable for the enemies. Outposts also serve a subtle political function. Their presence forces the barbarian communities to coexist daily with Roman power. It is no longer a distant enemy that only appears during summer campaigns, but a constant reality. Merchants, emissaries, and tribal leaders regularly come into contact with the garrisons to negotiate, exchange information, ask for protection, or complain about abuses. In this way, war is intertwined with an embryonic form of indirect administration. Rome does not directly govern these territories, but profoundly influences their internal balance. From a military perspective, outposts serve as advanced sensors. Every suspicious movement is reported, every concentration of armed men is observed and evaluated. In the 180, this system allows for the prevention of large upheavals, but does not eliminate the risk of local accidents. Small clashes, ambushes, sudden attacks against patrols or convoys are a constant. These episodes do not always degenerate into open conflicts, but they contribute to keeping tension high. For Roman soldiers, the border is never completely safe, even in times of relative calm. The preparation of defenses is not only about physical structures, but also about operational readiness. The garrisons are trained to react quickly, to resist until reinforcements arrive, and not to be surprised. In 180 AD, after years of experience, The army refined standard procedures to deal with sudden emergencies. Smoke signals, messengers on horseback, pre-established intervention plans allow a coordinated response. It's not an infallible system, but it represents a huge advantage over enemies, who must rely on slower and less structured communications. The Roman presence in the territory also had a human cost. The local populations, already tested by years of war, suffer requisitions, forced displacements, limitations on freedom of movement. This fuels an underground resentment that makes any pacification fragile. Roman commanders are aware of this and try, whenever possible, to balance force with negotiation. But in the context of 180, with the army still in war mode, the priority remains the security of the front. Stability comes before consensus. As a whole, the system of outposts and fortifications of 180 AD represents one of the moments of maximum extension of Roman control beyond the Danube. It is a presence that looks to the future, to a possible stable integration of these regions into the empire, but which is also burdened by everything it requires to be maintained. Every fort is a promise and a risk, every garrison an investment that can provide security or provoke new hostilities. In this precarious balance, Rome continues to walk forward without knowing if the ground will hold. The border, in that year, was not just a line to defend, but a threshold to decide whether to cross definitively or abandon. During 180 AD, while the Danube front appeared stabilized in its extension and its network of garrisons, the empire's real effort was concentrated on the continuous preparation of the army. After more than a decade of almost uninterrupted war, Rome has understood that the survival of the border does not depend only on the number of troops deployed, but on their ability to regenerate, adapt and maintain efficiency in extreme conditions. The army that guards the Danube in this last year of Marcus Aurelius is not a static body, but an organism in constant transformation, subjected to a process of strengthening which concerns men, structures, tactics, and mentality. The losses accumulated in previous years have forced a profound change. Many veterans have fallen, others have been discharged due to age or wounds, and the void has been filled with recruits from every corner of the empire. In 180 AD, Italic soldiers, provincial soldiers from Gaul, Hispania, Africa, and the Balkans coexisted in the same units, together with auxiliary contingents recruited from populations who had only recently been fighting for Rome rather than against it. This heterogeneity is not an anomaly, but a structural feature of the mature Roman army. However, in such a long border war, it requires a constant effort of integration and training. Training in the 180 is not the spectacular one of large maneuvers in the open field, but a daily, repetitive, often tiring job. The soldiers are prepared for forced marches in difficult climatic conditions, to build fortifications quickly, to react to sudden ambushes. Tactics are adapted to an enemy that rarely accepts head-on confrontation, preferring to strike and retreat. The Roman army, traditionally organized for pitched battle, learned to fight a war of pursuit, territorial control, and constant pressure. In 180 AD, this ability was now an integral part of the operational baggage of the Danubian legions. Strengthening the army also involves equipment. Weapons and armor are carefully maintained and repaired, aware that any shortage can prove fatal in a context where supplies are not always immediate. Auxiliary units, particularly cavalry, take on an increasing role. Against mobile enemies like the Sarmatians, the ability to move quickly is crucial. Over the years, Rome has integrated more and more knights recruited from populations accustomed to fighting on horseback, exploiting their skills without giving up Roman disciplinary control. In 180, these departments are now indispensable for surveillance and rapid reaction. The preparation is not only physical and technical, but also organizational. The Danube army functions like a complex machine, in which each department must know not only how to fight, but also collaborate with the others. Communications, signals, emergency procedures are repeated and perfected. In the event of an alarm, each unit must know where to go, who to command, and which objectives to protect. This standardization, refined over the course of the war, is one of the factors that allows Rome to maintain control despite the vastness of the front. Discipline remains the pillar on which the entire system rests. In 180 AD, it was not imposed only with the severity of punishments, but also through a sense of belonging built over time. The legions fighting on the Danube have developed their own identity, forged by years of shared sacrifice. The commanders are aware of this and try to enhance it, resorting to honors, public recognition, distribution of donations when finances allow it. These gestures, although limited, have a strong symbolic value in a context of prolonged attrition. Alongside discipline, the need to manage tiredness emerges. The Marcomannic War is not a short campaign, but a test of collective resistance. In 180 AD, many soldiers have been at the front for years, and the idea of an imminent conclusion to the conflict begins to circulate, fueling hopes and fears. On the one hand, the prospect of the end strengthens motivation. On the other hand, it increases restlessness, because any delay can be experienced as a betrayal of expectations. Commanders must therefore carefully calibrate operational demands, avoiding pushing troops beyond the limit without obvious reason. The Army's preparation also includes a less visible but crucial aspect: health management. Diseases, favored by climatic conditions and life in crowded camps, represent a constant threat. Military doctors, field infirmaries, patient isolation procedures are an integral part of the organization. In 1800, the accumulated experience has improved the ability to deal with local epidemics, but the risk remains high. An army weakened by disease is as vulnerable as one defeated in battle. Marcus Aurelius follows these aspects carefully, aware that the strength of the army does not lie only in courage, but in its ability to remain operational over time. His decisions reflect a rational vision of war, far from ephemeral enthusiasm. Strengthening the army also means knowing when not to use it unnecessarily. In 180 AD, many operations were postponed or limited precisely to preserve forces, waiting for more favorable conditions or a political conclusion to the conflict. From a barbaric point of view, this constant preparation has a deterrent effect. The tribes observe an army that, despite its fatigue, shows no signs of slowing down. The presence of well-trained troops ready to react discourages large-scale initiatives, but does not completely eliminate the risk of clashes. War remains an always open possibility, and for this very reason preparation can never stop. In 180 AD, the Roman army on the Danube is the result of a long process of adaptation. It is no longer the army of great conquests, but that of active defense, of the management of an unstable border. Its strength does not lie in the illusion of invincibility, but in the ability to resist, absorb blows, and continue to function. This incessant preparation, made up of training, discipline, and patience, reflects the last great effort of an empire which, under the leadership of Marcus Aurelius, still tries to govern chaos without succumbing to it. In 180 AD, the war knew no real pause. Even if the great spectacular campaigns of previous years are missing, the conflict continues to manifest itself in a dense sequence of clashes, punitive actions, containment operations, and local fighting which, taken together, define the character of Marcus Aurelius last year. It is a less flashy war, but no less real, fought far from the triumphal celebrations and closer to the daily toil of the soldiers. Every clash, even the most limited, has a strategic value, because it contributes to maintaining or breaking that unstable balance that holds the Danube border. The clashes of 180 do not take the form of a decisive battle, but of a series of episodes distributed along the front. The sources, in particular Cassius Dio, do not always provide precise details, but suggest that military activity remains intense. The subjugated tribes are not entirely pacified, and small armed groups continue to test Roman resistance. These are often targeted incursions, aimed at looting, recovering resources, or demonstrating that Roman authority is not omnipresent. For Rome, responding to these attacks is not just a question of immediate security, but of credibility. Every unpunished incursion risks triggering a chain reaction. Roman actions in 180 therefore focused on the rapid and targeted repression of these foci of instability. Reinforced patrols, mobile columns, and cavalry units are used to chase and hit hostile groups before they can regroup. These clashes often take place in difficult environments: dense forests, swampy areas, little-known valleys. They are not orderly battles, but confused battles, made up of ambushes and sudden counterattacks. Roman superiority manifests itself in the ability to react in a coordinated manner, not to be drawn into risky pursuits, to strike and retreat when necessary. From a strategic point of view, these operations have a clear objective: to prevent the reconstitution of large barbarian coalitions. In previous years, Rome has learned that the real danger arises when multiple tribes manage to coordinate. In 180 AD, every sign of possible aggregation is faced decisively. Punitive actions are not only aimed at inflicting casualties, but at disarticulating enemy command structures, hitting local leaders, destroying assembly centers, dispersing groups before they can unite. It is an aggressive prevention strategy, which requires timely information and a constant military presence. Some clashes involve Sarmatian contingents, in particular groups of knights who attempt to exploit their mobility to circumvent the Roman garrisons. Against them, the Roman army increasingly uses auxiliary cavalry, adapting its tactics to an enemy that avoids frontal clash. These fast and violent battles are rarely described in detail by sources, but their impact is significant. Each Sarmatian knight captured or killed reduces the offensive capacity of groups that base their strength on speed and the effect of surprise. There is also no shortage of clashes with Germanic groups, especially between the Marcomanni and the Quadi, where formal submission does not coincide with real pacification. In some cases, the sources speak of violations of treaties, of unauthorized incursions, of refusal to provide promised contingents. The Roman response was immediate and calibrated. It is not a question of annihilating entire populations, but of punishing selectively to restore order. These operations strengthen the perception of still firm Roman control, but also fuel a resentment that remains latent. From the point of view of consequences, the clashes of 180 produce mixed results. On the immediate military level, Rome maintains the initiative and prevents a collapse of the front. No significant breakthroughs or major territorial losses were recorded. However, the human cost is real. Every clash, even a minor one, causes deaths and injuries, and contributes to the overall wear and tear of the army. This attrition is less visible than a resounding defeat, but just as dangerous in the long run. The sources do not hand down heroic anecdotes comparable to those of the great battles, but this very absence is revealing. 180 AD is the year of a now normalized war, in which individual courage is consumed in the routine of service. Isolated episodes of valor, of resistance in difficult conditions, of effective command in sudden situations, emerge only indirectly, through honorary inscriptions or fragmentary mentions. They are stories of men who fight without expecting glory, aware that their task is simply to prevent the situation from degenerating. A fundamental strategic aspect of the clashes of 180 is their connection with imperial politics. Marcus Aurelius, although following the operations carefully, avoided transforming these battles into a new major offensive. Each action is also evaluated based on the possibility of a diplomatic conclusion to the conflict. The war must remain under control, not explode again. This choice, rational but tiring, requires iron discipline on the part of field commanders, who must resist the temptation to pursue tactical successes at the expense of general stability. The balance of the 180 clashes, considered as a whole, is that of a war that does not take decisive steps forward, but does not retreat either. Rome retains strategic superiority, but fails to transform it into a definitive victory. Enemies are contained, not eliminated. The border holds, but only thanks to continuous commitment. In this sense, the clashes of Marcus Aurelius last year are emblematic of the nature of the Marcomannic Wars, conflicts of attrition, in which success is not measured in spectacular conquests, but in the ability to avoid the worst. As the year progresses, it becomes increasingly clear that the fate of the war will not depend on a decisive confrontation, but on political and personal events. The weapons continue to speak, but in a low voice, as if they too perceive that a historical phase is about to end. The battles of 180 AD are not the final act of an epic tragedy, but the background noise of a changing world, in which the strength of Rome is still present, but no longer unlimited, and in which every victory already has the flavor of a farewell. As 180 AD progressed, the conflict along the Danube entered a phase that was no longer defined so much by military operations as by their immediate consequences. After months of fragmented clashes and constant control of the territory, the front appears stable, but this stability has a high cost and an ambiguous meaning. Rome did not suffer decisive reverses, but neither did it obtain the clear conclusion that Marcus Aurelius had probably imagined in previous years. The military balance of the year, observed with the cold gaze of the imperial administrator, is that of a defensive success accompanied by a growing awareness of the limits. On a territorial level, Roman control remains extensive and coherent. The defensive lines hold, the outposts beyond the Danube continue to function, and the subjugated tribes, although restless, are unable to organize a general uprising. This result is not a given and represents, in itself, a victory. In a context where a single failure could trigger a new wave of invasions, maintaining order is equivalent to a silent triumph. However, this triumph did not result in a lasting expansion of Roman rule. The regions beyond the river remain militarily occupied, but not integrated, and the prospect of their transformation into stable provinces appears increasingly distant. The losses suffered by the army during 1800, although not catastrophic, added to those of previous years. Men fallen in minor clashes, victims of disease, wounded who will never return to service. The attrition is continuous and cumulative. Every department bears the signs of this slow erosion. The ranks are being filled, but at the cost of ever-increasing recruitment and a growing dependence on auxiliary contingents. The army remains effective, but its composition reflects an empire drawing on all its human resources to sustain a sustained war effort. Even from an economic point of view, the year's budget is heavy. The Danube provinces, devastated by years of war, are struggling to recover. The internal regions of the empire continue to bear the burden of supplies and military expenses. This effort is still sustainable, but not indefinitely. Marcus Aurelius is aware of this, and his decisions in 180 show a growing attention to the need to stabilize rather than expand. The war must end, or at least transform into a less costly armed peace. It is in this context that the event destined to radically change the course of things takes place, the death of Marcus Aurelius. Sources place his end in 180 AD, probably in Vindobona or near Sirmium, in a military camp that symbolically reflects his entire life as emperor. He dies far from Rome, among the soldiers, as he had lived for much of his reign. His disappearance is not only the loss of a sovereign, but the end of a personal balance on which the entire conduct of the war was based. The army's reaction is composed, but full of meaning. Marcus Aurelius was deeply respected, not for his spectacular charisma, but for his moral coherence and sharing of difficulties. His death leaves a void that cannot be filled simply by institutional continuity. The legions remain loyal to the new emperor, Commodus, but the nature of this loyalty is different. It is no longer the bond built over the years of marches and camps, but rather the obedience due to an inherited authority. With the rise of Commodus, the Roman strategy on the Danube underwent a clear change. The new emperor does not share his father's approach to war. Less inclined to stay on the front and more interested in consolidating his power in Rome, Commodus looked at the Marcomannic Wars as a burden to be eliminated quickly. Over the course of 1800, this different vision translated into a clear desire to end the conflict, even at the cost of giving up ambitious objectives. Negotiations with the barbarian populations, already underway or possible thanks to the favorable military situation, were accelerated. Rome is in a position of relative strength, sufficient to impose conditions that guarantee immediate border security, but not enough to justify an indefinite continuation of the war. The agreements provide for the withdrawal of troops from the most advanced positions and the renunciation of the creation of new provinces beyond the Danube. In exchange, the tribes agree to maintain peace, respect the border, and continue to provide military contingents. From a strictly military point of view, this choice can be interpreted as a renunciation. After years of sacrifices, the army withdraws from territories conquered with difficulty. But from a political and strategic point of view, it represents a pragmatic decision. The border is shortened, made more defensible, and the empire can concentrate its resources elsewhere. 180 AD thus becomes a year of transition, in which the war does not end with a crushing victory, but with a negotiated solution. The overall balance of the year reflects this ambivalence. Rome emerged from the Marcomannic Wars without having suffered a decisive defeat, but also without having fully realized its ambitions. The Danube remains a safe but fragile border. The army is experienced and hardened, but tired. The death of Marcus Aurelius symbolically marks the end of an era in which the empire tried to govern the crisis with the force of reason and discipline. 180 AD, observed closely, is therefore not only the last year of a war, but the crossing point between two different ways of understanding imperial power. With Marcus Aurelius, the season of the emperor who lives on the front and conceives war as a moral duty ends. With Commodus, a phase begins in which internal stability and the image of power take on greater weight. The decisions taken this year reflect this turning point and anticipate its consequences. The Marcomannic War does not end in a single moment, but in 180 it loses its historical direction. From that moment on, the Danube border will no longer be the site of a great offensive ambition, but a line to be defended, with increasing caution, against an increasingly uncertain future. When 180 AD comes to an end, What remains of the Marcomannic Wars is not a clash of weapons, but a tense silence, full of consequences. The Danube front, which for almost 15 years was the most sensitive point of the empire, stabilized in a new, less ambitious and more prudent form. The legions, who had pushed their presence beyond the river, began an orderly retreat, not imposed by defeat but decided by political will. This movement does not happen suddenly or chaotically. It is a reasoned retreat, punctuated by agreements, exchanges of hostages, redefinition of obligations and borders. Rome does not flee, but recomposes itself, choosing to concentrate its strength on a shorter and more defensible line. The advanced outposts, built and maintained at the cost of great sacrifices, are gradually abandoned or reduced to temporary garrisons. Some are dismantled, others left to local populations, deprived of their military function. This process has a strong symbolic value. It marks the concrete end of the project of a stable Roman presence beyond the Danube, at least in this historical phase. The legions return to the large forts on the southern bank, strengthening the traditional limes and transforming it back into the main line of defense. The border returns to being a clear frontier, shallower but more controllable. For the barbarian populations, the conclusion of the conflict does not equate to total liberation, but to a change in relationship. The treaties stipulated in 180 set clear obligations: respect for the border, cessation of raids, supply of military contingents to Rome. In exchange, the empire renounces direct and permanent control of their territories. It is a conditional peace, based on the balance of forces rather than on trust. The tribes emerge from the war tested, partially decimated, but still existing, capable of reorganizing themselves over time. Rome, for its part, obtained what it considered essential: the immediate security of the Danube provinces. The Roman army, the absolute protagonist of these years, faces the end of the war with mixed feelings. For many soldiers, returning to the limes represents a liberation, the end of continuous tension, the possibility of a more stable life. For others, especially for the veterans who fought for years across the river, the retreat has the bitter taste of an unfinished work. They have seen territories conquered, enemies defeated, and now they witness a return that seems to erase part of those sacrifices. However, discipline prevails. The Roman army accepts the imperial decision because that is what it does. It obeys, it adapts, it continues to exist. From a structural point of view, the Marcomannic Wars left a profound mark on the military apparatus. The Danube legions are among the most experienced in the empire, hardened by a long and complex war. The tactics developed against mobile enemies, the intensive use of auxiliary cavalry, the management of an extended and unstable front became the permanent heritage of the Roman army. At the same time, the cost of this model clearly emerges. Border warfare requires ongoing commitment, which can only be sustained as long as human and economic resources permit. 180 AD marks the moment in which Rome implicitly recognizes that this limit has been reached. The Danube, having returned to being the main border, takes on an even more central value. It is no longer just a geographical barrier, but a mental line, the point beyond which the empire decides not to go permanently. This choice is not a sign of immediate weakness, but of political realism. Rome remains powerful, but not omnipotent. The Marcomannic Wars demonstrated that direct control of vast barbarian regions requires effort disproportionate to the benefits. Better a solid border than a fragile expansion. The change in strategy is also reflected in the internal political climate. With Commodus, the empire enters a different phase, in which the personal presence of the emperor on the front is no longer considered indispensable. The center of power gradually returned to Rome, and the Danube lost the role of military capital it had had in the last years of Marcus Aurelius. This move is not just logistical, but symbolic. War is no longer the fulcrum of imperial action, but one of the many issues to be managed. Peace, even if armed and imperfect, becomes a priority. Looking at 180 AD as a whole, it appears clear that it represents a caesura. Not so much for the formal end of hostilities, but for the change in perspective. The Marcomannic Wars did not end with a spectacular triumph nor with a defeat, but with a political decision that accepted compromise. In this sense, their outcome is profoundly Roman, pragmatic, calculated, oriented towards preservation rather than glory. However, this same choice contains within itself the seeds of future fragility. The border is safe, but the root causes of the tensions remain. The populations beyond the Danube have not disappeared, and the balance of power will continue to change. The anecdotes that emerge from the sources about this final period are few, but significant. We talk about soldiers who, upon their return, bring with them memories of distant lands, of barbarian families who had started trading with the Romans, of tribal leaders who had learned to deal with imperial officials. They are fragments of a forced coexistence, born from war and interrupted before transforming into integration. These episodes, although marginal, show how much the border had become a place of contact, not just conflict. In the end, 180 AD ends without fanfare. The legions remain in place, the Danube continues to flow, and the empire seems to have overcome one of its toughest tests. But beneath this apparent normality there is a profound change. With the death of Marcus Aurelius and the conclusion of the Marcomannic Wars, the last great season in which Rome attempted to resolve a systemic crisis with the direct presence of the emperor and with a total mobilization of its moral and military resources ends. The brief conclusion of this long year can only be sober. 180 AD does not mark the collapse of the empire, but reveals its limits. The Marcomannic Wars, which ended without a definitive victory, show a Roman world still strong, but forced to choose. Between expansion and conservation, Rome opts for the second. It is a rational choice, perhaps inevitable, but also full of consequences. In the silence that follows the return of the legions, the echo of future challenges can already be heard. The border is safe, for now. Time, however, began to take its toll.